March 5th, a young woman walked into the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, India. She was 5 years old, exhausted, terrified, and carrying nothing but a small suitcase. The embassy guards didn't recognize her at first. Then she told them her name, Svetlana Alilieva, Stalin's daughter. Within hours, the news reached Washington. The CIA briefed President Lyndon Johnson. The State Department went into crisis mode. Soviet diplomats were furious, demanding her immediate return. But buried in the classified files, someone found something nobody expected: a letter, written 4 years earlier by President Harry Truman. A personal letter to Stalin's daughter that American intelligence had intercepted before it reached her. And in that letter, Truman had written something that would have destroyed his political career if it became public. He called Joseph Stalin an honorable man. This wasn't about Cold War politics. This was about a promise Truman had made to a dead dictator. A promise that haunted him for years. A promise that revealed something about Harry Truman that contradicted everything Americans thought they knew about him. The story begins in Fay, at Potsdam, but not the public conference you've read about. This is about what happened in the private meetings between Truman and Stalin. Conversations that weren't recorded in official transcripts, moments when the translator was dismissed and only the two leaders remained. Truman arrived at Potsdam expecting to dislike Stalin. Everyone had told him Stalin was a monster, a tyrant, a liar who couldn't be trusted. Churchill had spent weeks trying to poison Truman against the Soviet leader. American intelligence had briefed Truman on Stalin's purges, his brutality, his paranoia. Truman walked into that first meeting prepared to face a villain. What he found instead was something more complicated, something that confused him, something that would shape American-Soviet relations in ways nobody understood at the time. Their first private conversation happened on July 5th. After the official session ended, the translators left. The advisors were dismissed. It was just Truman and Stalin, sitting across from each other in a room in the Sicilienhof Palace. And Stalin did something unexpected. He started talking about his daughter. Stalin told Truman about Svetlana. She was 4 years old, studying at Moscow University. She was his youngest child, the only one he still had a relationship with. His sons were grown, distant, complicated, but Svetlana was different. Stalin talked about how intelligent she was, how she loved literature and languages, how she reminded him of her mother who had died when Svetlana was 6. Truman was surprised. This wasn't the Stalin he'd been briefed about. This was a father talking about his daughter with genuine affection. Truman, who had his own daughter Margaret, found himself connecting with Stalin on this personal level. They talked about the challenges of raising children in public life, about protecting them from politics, about wanting better futures for them than the wars they'd lived through. Then Stalin said something that stuck with Truman. He said, "Mr. President, I know what the world thinks of me. I know the things that have been necessary, but I want my daughter to live in a world where Soviet and American children don't have to kill each other. That is why I'm here, not for myself, for her generation." Was it manipulation? Probably. Stalin was a master at reading people, at finding their weak spots, at saying exactly what they needed to hear, but Truman bought it. Or at least, he wanted to believe it, because Truman desperately wanted to believe that the peace they were building at Potsdam would last. Over the next 2 weeks at Potsdam, Stalin repeatedly brought up his daughter in private conversations with Truman. He showed Truman a photograph of Svetlana. He talked about her education, her interests, her questions about America, and each time, Stalin would connect it back to the same theme, building a world where their children wouldn't be enemies. Truman fell for it completely. He started seeing Stalin not as a totalitarian dictator, but as another leader trying to navigate impossible circumstances, a father who loved his daughter and wanted peace. It was exactly what Stalin intended, but here is where it gets complicated. Stalin wasn't just manipulating Truman, there was truth in what he said about Svetlana. Stalin did love his daughter, as much as a man like Stalin could love anyone. She was his weakness, his vulnerability, the one person who could make him feel human. And Stalin, in his twisted way, was sincere about wanting her to inherit a peaceful world. He just had a very different definition of peace than Truman did. On July 5th, near the end of the conference, Stalin asked Truman for a private meeting. No advisors, no translators, just the two of them with a single interpreter they both trusted. What happened in that meeting wasn't recorded in any official transcript, but years later, Truman's personal diary entries and letters to his wife Bess revealed what Stalin proposed. Stalin told Truman that he was dying. Not immediately, but soon. He had health problems he couldn't control. He didn't know how many years he had left. Maybe 5, maybe 10, but he was thinking about what happened after he died, and he was worried about Svetlana. Stalin explained that in the Soviet system he'd created, being Stalin's daughter after Stalin died would be dangerous. His successors would see her as a threat, a symbol they couldn't control, a person who knew too much. Stalin was afraid that after his death, Svetlana would be imprisoned, exiled, or worse. Then Stalin made an extraordinary request. He asked Truman to give Svetlana asylum if she ever needed it. Not now, not while Stalin was alive, but later if she came to America seeking protection. Stalin was asking his ideological enemy to protect his daughter from his own regime. Truman's response shocked even himself. He said yes. He promised Stalin that if Svetlana ever came to America seeking asylum, she would be protected. He gave his word, not as president to premier, but as one father to another. But Stalin wanted more than a verbal promise. He asked Truman to write a letter, a personal letter to Svetlana that Stalin would keep, that Svetlana could use as proof of Truman's promise if she ever needed asylum. Stalin said he wanted Svetlana to know there was someone outside the Soviet Union who would help her if everything went wrong. This put Truman in an impossible position. Writing such a letter was politically insane. If it became public, if anyone found out that Truman had promised Stalin's daughter asylum, it would be seen as collaboration with the enemy, as weakness, as betrayal. Republicans would crucify him. His own advisers would think he'd lost his mind, but Truman, in that moment, wasn't thinking like a president. He was thinking like a father. He remembered holding his own daughter Margaret when she was born. He thought about what he would do if he were dying and needed to protect her. He thought about whether there was any father in the world, even Joseph Stalin, who didn't deserve the chance to protect his child. Truman wrote the letter. He wrote it by hand, in his cabin at Potsdam, late at night, when no one would see. He didn't tell his advisers. He didn't tell the State Department. He wrote it and gave it to Stalin the next morning in a private meeting that lasted less than 5 minutes. The letter has never been publicly released. The CIA classified it at the highest level when they intercepted a copy years later. But according to people who saw it, Truman wrote something like this: Miss Alilieva, your father has asked me to write this letter to you. He is concerned about your future and has asked me to promise that if you ever come to the United States seeking protection, you will be received with respect and given sanctuary. I have given your father my word on this, not because of politics, but because no father should die worrying about his daughter's safety. Your father is an honorable man who loves his country and loves you. If you ever need help, show this letter to American officials. It will be honored, Harry S. Truman. Your father is an honorable man. Those 5 words in Truman's handwriting about Joseph Stalin, the same Stalin who had killed millions in purges, the same Stalin who had starved Ukraine, the same Stalin who would later blockade Berlin and support North Korea's invasion of the South. Truman called him an honorable man. Why? Because in that moment at Potsdam, Truman believed that a man who loved his daughter enough to humble himself and ask his enemy for help had honor, even if everything else he'd done was monstrous. It was the kind of moral complexity Truman's critics said he was incapable of understanding. Stalin kept the letter. He never gave it to Svetlana. He locked it in his personal safe with his most sensitive documents. Maybe he planned to give it to her before he died. Maybe he kept it as insurance, as leverage he might need someday. Or maybe Stalin, who trusted no one, couldn't bring himself to trust even Truman's promise. Stalin died on March 5th. Truman was no longer president. Eisenhower had taken office in January, When Stalin's safe was opened, Soviet officials found the letter from Truman. They understood immediately how explosive it was. The new Soviet leadership under Khrushchev kept it hidden. They never told Svetlana it existed. But American intelligence learned about the letter. The CIA had sources inside the Kremlin who reported what had been found in Stalin's safe. When Eisenhower was briefed, he was furious. He demanded to know why Truman had written such a letter, why he'd made such a promise, why he'd compromised American credibility by calling Stalin honorable. Eisenhower confronted Truman about it in Fay during a private meeting. Truman's response was defiant. He told Eisenhower, "I gave my word to a dying father. I don't care what you think about Stalin. I don't care what anyone thinks. I made a promise, and I meant it. If his daughter ever shows up asking for asylum, we're giving it to her. That is final." Eisenhower didn't agree, but he couldn't reverse Truman's promise without causing a political scandal. So the letter remained classified, buried in CIA files, known to only a handful of people in the American government, for 4 years. Nothing happened. Svetlana lived in Moscow. She married, had children, worked as a translator and teacher. She knew nothing about Truman's letter. She didn't know her father had tried to protect her. She didn't know there was a promise waiting in America if she ever needed it. Then, in Fay, everything changed. Svetlana had gone to India to scatter the ashes of her second husband. While there, she decided she couldn't go back to the Soviet Union. She was suffocating under constant surveillance, under the weight of being Stalin's daughter, under a regime that treated her as both a trophy and a threat. She walked into the US Embassy in New Delhi and asked for asylum. The embassy staff contacted Washington immediately. President Johnson was briefed. The State Department argued about what to do. The Soviets were demanding her return, threatening diplomatic consequences. Then someone in the CIA remembered the letter. The letter Truman had written 4 years earlier, the promise he'd made to Stalin. They pulled it from classified files and showed it to Johnson. Johnson read it and made his decision. "We're giving her asylum." Truman gave his word. "That is enough for me." But there was a problem. Svetlana didn't know about the letter. Truman had written it, but Stalin never gave it to her. The promise existed, but she had no idea it had been made. Should they tell her? Should they reveal that her father, in his final years, had tried to protect her by asking America for help? The CIA argued against telling her. They said it would complicate the situation, that it raised questions about Truman's judgment, that it revealed too much about private diplomatic conversations. Johnson agreed. Svetlana was given asylum, but nobody told her about Truman's letter or his promise to her father. Svetlana arrived in America in April. She held a press conference where she denounced the Soviet system and declared her intention to live free. She was famous overnight. Stalin's daughter rejecting everything her father had built. Truman, now 4 years old and living in Independence, Missouri, watched the news coverage. He saw Stalin's daughter speaking about freedom and democracy, and he remembered that conversation at Potsdam. Stalin talking about his daughter, asking for protection, showing a father's fear and love. Truman wanted to contact Svetlana. He wanted to tell her about the promise he'd made to her father, but his advisors and former State Department officials urged him not to. They said it would create problems, that it would be misunderstood, that at his age he should avoid controversy. But Truman, being Truman, didn't listen. In May, he wrote Svetlana a letter, not an official letter, just a personal note. He told her he was glad she was safe in America. He told her about meeting her father at Potsdam. He told her that Stalin had loved her and had wanted her to be free. And then Truman wrote something extraordinary. He wrote, "Your father asked me to protect you if you ever needed it. I gave him my word. I called him an honorable man in that promise, and I meant it. Not because of his politics, but because a father who loves his daughter that much has honor, whatever else he may be." Truman's letter reached Svetlana in June. She was living in Princeton, New Jersey, adjusting to her new life. When she read Truman's letter, she wept. Nobody had told her about Truman's original promise. Nobody had told her that her father, in those final years, had been thinking about her safety, had humbled himself to ask America for help. Svetlana wrote back to Truman. She thanked him for honoring his promise to her father. She said it was the kindest thing anyone in America had done for her because it gave her something she'd lost, a sense that her father, despite everything, had loved her. They exchanged several letters over the next few years until Truman's health declined. The letters were personal, never political. They talked about family, about loss, about trying to build new lives after being defined by history. Truman never apologized for calling Stalin honorable. Svetlana never asked him to explain it. Truman died in Fay. Svetlana attended a private memorial service for him in New York. She told people there that Harry Truman was the only American leader who had treated her father as a human being, not just as a monster. She said Truman's promise had saved her life and given her freedom. The full story of Truman's letter didn't become public until 1990, after the Cold War ended and classified documents were declassified. When historians discovered it, they were shocked. How could Truman, who had stood up to Stalin over Berlin and Korea, who had contained Soviet expansion, call Stalin an honorable man? The answer is complicated. Truman hated what Stalin had done to his own people. He opposed Soviet aggression. He built NATO and the Marshall Plan to stop Stalin's expansion. But Truman also believed that people were more complex than their politics, that even monsters could have moments of humanity, that a father's love for his daughter transcended ideology. Was Truman naive? Maybe was he manipulated by Stalin? Possibly, but Truman kept his promise, and that promise gave Svetlana Alexievna a chance at freedom. She lived in America, on and off, for the rest of her life. She died in 2011, 44 years after defecting, 66 years after Truman made his promise to her father. The letter Truman wrote at Potsdam, the one calling Stalin an honorable man, remains classified. The CIA has never released it publicly. But its existence reveals something important about Truman that his tough guy image obscures. He believed that honor could exist even in terrible people, that promises mattered even to enemies, that a father's love for his daughter was something you could respect even in a dictator. Historians still debate whether Truman was right to make that promise, whether he compromised American interests by sympathizing with Stalin as a father. But Svetlana had no doubts. She spent the rest of her life telling anyone who would listen that Harry Truman was a man of his word, and that her father, whatever else he was, had loved her enough to ask his greatest enemy for help. That is the truth about the letter. Not about Cold War strategy or diplomatic games, but about two fathers in a palace in Potsdam talking about their daughters, making a promise that transcended politics. Truman kept that promise 22 years later, and in doing so he honored something more important than ideology, the word of one father to another.